Good evening, dear listeners. I am Lady S. Ashcroft, and tonight we walk together through the fog-shrouded streets of old London, where the ancient Charleys kept their lonely vigil before the coming of the peelers changed everything. Rest now, and let us begin. It is 2 o'clock in the morning in London, in the year 1820. The city sleeps, but not peacefully. If you were to stand on any street corner in this hour, the first thing that would strike you would not be what you see, but what you cannot see. The darkness here is absolute, total, a blackness so complete that your hand held before your face disappears into nothingness. There are no street lamps as we know them, not yet. Gaslighting will come, but not for some years still. Here in 1820, the night belongs entirely to itself. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of coal smoke that hangs in the dampness like a shroud. Every chimney in every narrow house burns coal through the winter months, and the smoke settles low over the rooftops, mixing with the fog that rolls up from the Thames. To create a peculiar thickness to the darkness, a texture, as though the night itself has weight. You can taste it on your tongue, soot and moisture, the faint bitterness of coal dust coating the back of your throat. The Thames is close. You can hear it, even if you cannot see it. The slow, sluggish movement of water against the embankment. The creak of moored boats rocking gently in their berths. Occasionally, the splash of something or someone entering the water. You do not investigate such sounds, not at this hour. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick, damp from the perpetual London fog. They are uneven, treacherous in the darkness. Between them, the gaps are filled with filth. Refuse thrown from windows, the remnants of the day's commerce, things best left unexamined. The buildings lean inward. These ancient timber frame structures bow toward one another across the narrow lanes, their upper stories jutting out so far that they nearly touch. This creates tunnels of darkness, corridors where not even starlight penetrates. Walking through these passages is like moving through the throat of some great beast. There is sound, but it is sporadic, distant. The bark of a dog, far off in the rookeries. The clatter of a late cart on distant cobblestones. The driver hurrying to finish his deliveries and escape the streets before the night deepens further. Sometimes laughter, drunk and raucous, spilling from a tavern not yet shuttered. Then silence again. The silence is not peaceful. It is watchful. In the spaces between buildings, in the courts and alleyways, there is movement, shapes that do not wish to be seen. The poor huddle in doorways, wrapped in whatever rags they possess. Children sleep in clusters for warmth. Others move with purpose through the darkness. Those who conduct their business only when honest folk are sleeping. The quality of the cold is particular. It seeps upward from the stones, downward from the fog. It finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. It settles into your bones and makes a home there. The watchmen know this cold intimately. They carry it with them always, even in summer, a chill that becomes part of their constitution. If you listen carefully, you might hear the river rats. London's rats are legendary, bold creatures, fat from the abundance of refuse, unafraid of humans. They move in packs through the darkness, their claws clicking on stone, their bodies rustling through piles of debris. The smell of the river grows stronger when the wind shifts. It is not merely water. It is everything the city has deposited there. Waste, industrial runoff, the ballast from ships, sometimes bodies. The Thames in 1820 is an open sewer, and its presence permeates everything. Above, there are no stars. The coal smoke and fog see to that. On rare clear nights, you might glimpse the moon, but it is a fleeting thing, quickly swallowed again by the perpetual haze. The sky is simply another layer of darkness, indistinguishable from the earth. This is the London that waits, that holds its breath between dusk and dawn. A city that transforms entirely when the sun sets, becoming something other than itself, something older, something that remembers when there were no cities at all, only forest and fen and the things that moved through them. And somewhere in this darkness, a single lantern bobs, moving slowly, methodically. The night watchman makes his rounds, a tiny point of light in an ocean of black. His footsteps echo in the empty streets. His breath clouds before him, briefly visible in the glow of his lantern before dissolving back into darkness. He is utterly alone. The night watchmen of old London were called many things, but most commonly they were known as Charleys, a name derived from King Charles I, who had reorganized the watch centuries before. By 1820, the name had become something of a jest, a term spoken with affection perhaps, but also with a certain knowing mockery. These were not young men. These were not soldiers or constables in any modern sense. The Charleys were, more often than not, elderly men past their prime, unable to find other work, men who had outlived their usefulness in the trades and industries that fed London's relentless growth. They were underpaid, desperately so. A watchman might earn perhaps 12 shillings a week, from which he had to provide his own lantern, his own fuel for that lantern, and often his own watchbox if the parish did not supply one. Many supplemented their income however they could. Small bribes to look the other way, payment to deliver messages, coins pressed into weathered palms in exchange for discretion. The watchbox itself was a pitiful thing, a small wooden structure, barely large enough for a man to sit inside, placed at street corners throughout the parish. Some were painted, others left to weather into grey obscurity. Inside, there was perhaps a small bench, a shelf for the lantern. Nothing more. In winter, these boxes provided scant protection from the elements. The wind found every crack. The cold settled in and would not be dislodged. A watchman's equipment was simple. A lantern, usually a metal frame with glass or horn panels, containing a single candle. The light it cast was feeble, a small bubble of illumination that did little against the vast darkness. Still, it was something. A marker that said, "Here is a man, here is the law, such as it is." He carried a wooden staff, not the truncheon of later police, but a simple length of hardwood, perhaps 4 feet long, sometimes topped with a crown or the insignia of the parish. It was meant to be a symbol of authority. In practice, it was a walking stick, and occasionally a weapon, though not one that inspired much fear in the hardened criminals who prowled the night. And he carried a rattle. This was his alarm, his means of summoning help, a wooden device that, when swung, produced a loud clacking sound that could carry through the narrow streets. If a watchman encountered trouble, a fire, a fight, a robbery in progress, he would swing his rattle furiously, hoping that other watchmen might hear and come running, or that the noise itself might frighten off the malefactors. The public's relationship with these watchmen was complicated. They were necessary. Everyone agreed on that. The alternative was complete lawlessness once darkness fell. But they were also figures of fun. Music hall songs mocked them. Broadsheets printed satirical verses about their age, their incompetence, their tendency to sleep in their boxes rather than patrol. Young men, returning drunk from taverns, would sometimes knock over watchboxes for sport, trapping the elderly occupant inside, or stealing his lantern and leaving him in darkness. The watchmen had little recourse. They were too old, too slow to give chase. They could only right their boxes, relight their lanterns if possible, and continue their rounds with what dignity remained. There were stories, countless stories, of watchmen who slept through robberies occurring mere feet from their boxes, of watchmen who, when roused to investigate a disturbance, arrived so slowly that the criminals had long since vanished, of watchmen who accepted coins to patrol elsewhere while certain establishments conducted their business undisturbed. Yet there was also a strange fondness for them. They were part of the fabric of London life, familiar figures who had walked the same routes for decades, old men who knew every resident of their parish, every doorway, every loose cobblestone. They were, in their way, the memory of the neighbourhood made flesh. Some parishes were better than others. Some watchmen were better than others. There were men who took their duty seriously, who patrolled diligently despite their years, who would confront danger with nothing but their wooden staff, because it was their job to do so. These men commanded genuine respect. Others simply needed the meagre income and did the bare minimum to avoid dismissal. They sat in their boxes, occasionally emerged to call the hour, and prayed that nothing requiring actual intervention would occur on their watch. The uniform, such as it was, varied by parish. Some watchmen wore long coats and broad-brimmed hats. Others had no uniform at all, simply whatever clothes they possessed that might withstand the nightly wear. By 1820, many parishes had settled on a general costume. A heavy coat, often with large buttons or insignia denoting their authority, and a hat of some kind to keep the rain from their faces. In winter, they wrapped themselves in layers, in scarves and mittens, until they resembled nothing so much as animated bundles of cloth shuffling through the darkness. In summer, the work was easier on the body but harder on the spirit. The long nights when one struggled to stay awake, when the warmth made every bench an invitation to rest, just for a moment. They were figures of transition, representatives of an older London, a slower London, a London that would soon be swept away by the tide of progress and reform. But for now, in 1820, they still kept their watch. These Charleys, these old men with their feeble lanterns and their wooden rattles, alone in the darkness, calling the hours, doing what they could. Every hour, throughout the night, the watchman's voice would ring out across the sleeping parish, past 12 o'clock, and a fair, clear night. Past 1 o'clock, and all's well. Past 2 o'clock, and a cold, frosty morning. This was not merely tradition. This was not ceremony. This calling of the hours was a fundamental duty of the night watch, as important as any patrol, any intervention, perhaps more important, because the voice was proof of presence, proof of vigilance, proof that someone was awake while you slept. In the absolute darkness of pre-gaslight London, sound became navigation. Sound became reassurance. The sleeping citizen could not see the watchman passing beneath their window, but they could hear him. And in that hearing, there was comfort. The call followed a pattern refined over generations. First, the hour, always past rather than the approaching hour, past 2 o'clock rather than nearly 3. This was practical. The watchman called when he heard the church bells toll, marking the passage of another hour. By the time he made his round, calling at each corner, it was indeed past that hour. Then, the weather. This was crucial information in an age before weather forecasts, before meteorology as we know it. A cold, frosty morning warned those who would rise early, labourers, market vendors, chimney sweeps, to prepare for the conditions they would face. A warm, fair night meant something different. A rainy night sent a different message still. Sometimes there were additions. Past 3 o'clock and all's well was the ideal call. It meant no fires had been spotted, no disturbances, no threats. The parish slept safely. But if something was amiss, the call changed. Past 3 o'clock and a fire in Cheapside. This would rouse the neighbourhood, send men running for buckets, for the fire engine if one could be found. The voice itself was important. It had to carry. These calls had to reach from one end of a street to the other, had to penetrate the walls of houses, had to rise above the ambient sounds of the city. Watchmen developed a particular cadence, a particular projection. It was almost a song, this calling of the hours, a chant that marked the rhythm of the night. For the elderly watchman, this constant calling took its toll. Night after night, year after year, crying out into the darkness. In winter, the cold air seared their throats. In damp weather, their voices grew hoarse, ragged. Some lost their voices entirely and had to retire from the work, unable to fulfill this most basic duty. But the citizens depended on it. In houses throughout London, people would wake briefly as the watchman passed, hear the call, and settle back into sleep, reassured. Mothers would wake and listen, counting the hours until dawn, calculating how much longer their children could sleep. The sick and the elderly, lying awake in pain, would mark the passage of time by these calls, each one bringing them closer to morning. There was a rhythm to the night, and the watchman's voice was its metronome. The calls also served another purpose, one less often spoken of. They told the watchman himself that he was still awake, still present, still alive. In the deep hours of the night, when exhaustion weighed heavy, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the act of calling out, of hearing one's own voice echo back from the buildings, was an anchor to consciousness. Some watchmen would embellish their calls, little flourishes of personality in the prescribed formula. Past 4 o'clock and the moon still shining, or past 5 o'clock and the bakers are rising. These small additions made each watchman distinctive. Residents would come to know the voices of their particular watchmen, could identify them in the darkness as surely as if they could see their faces. The voice was a thread connecting the sleeping world to the waking one. A reminder that the boundary between day and night, between safety and danger, was being maintained. That someone stood guard. In wealthy neighborhoods, the calls might be softer, more discreet. The quality of one's sleep was a luxury, and the rich did not appreciate being disturbed. But in the working parishes, the calls were loud and frequent. The watchman's voice became part of the soundscape of night, as familiar as the church bells themselves. Children grew up with these voices. They became part of memory, part of the texture of childhood. Decades later, those children, now adults, now elderly themselves, would remember lying in bed, hearing the watchman pass, hearing that reassuring call that meant all was well, that they could sleep safely. The voice was also a deterrent. A criminal, lurking in an alley, planning some mischief, would hear the watchman approaching. Past 2 o'clock and a cold, frosty morning, the voice announced presence. It announced that this street, at this moment, was observed. Many a petty theft was abandoned when that voice rang out unexpectedly close. And for the watchman himself, the calling provided rhythm to the endless hours. Each round of calls marked progress through the night. 12 o'clock seemed impossibly far from dawn. 1 o'clock brought it a little closer. 2 o'clock, closer still. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. These were the hardest hours, the deepest part of the night, when the body screamed for sleep. But then 5 o'clock, and the first hint that the night would eventually end. 6 o'clock, and in winter one might see the faintest lightning of the eastern sky. The calls structured time in darkness. They created order where there was only chaos. They transformed the formless night into something measured, something that could be endured. There were famous watchmen whose voices became legendary, men who had called the hours for 30, 40, even 50 years. Their voices became institutions unto themselves. When such a man finally retired or died, the neighborhood would mourn. The new watchman's voice, no matter how competent, would sound wrong. The rhythm of the night would feel broken. Some citizens complained about the noise. Petitions were occasionally raised to end the practice, to let people sleep undisturbed. But these complaints rarely gained traction, because deep down, even those who claimed to be annoyed knew the truth. The voice mattered. The voice meant someone was watching. In the absolute silence of the deep night, in the profound darkness, that voice crying out the hours was a lifeline. It connected each household to the larger community. It said, "You are not alone. London sleeps, but London also watches. The night is not empty. We are here. Past 3 o'clock, and all's well." The echo would fade. The watchman would move on to the next corner, and the sleeping city would hold that reassurance close, carrying it down into dreams, knowing that in another hour the voice would come again. But all was not always well. The night had teeth, and the watchman, alone in the darkness with his wooden staff and his guttering candle, knew this better than anyone. There were predators in old London, human predators who emerged when honest folk retreated behind locked doors. And the watchman, by the very nature of his duty, placed himself directly in their path. The body snatchers were perhaps the most feared. The resurrection men, they called themselves, a grotesque euphemism for men who made their living by stealing the recently dead. Medical schools needed bodies. Surgery and anatomy required cadavers for study. But the legal supply was desperately inadequate. Only the bodies of executed criminals could be officially dissected, and there were never enough of these to meet demand. So a black market emerged, a lucrative trade in stolen corpses. The resurrection men worked at night, naturally. They would visit graveyards, particularly those attached to parish churches, those places where the poor were buried in simple plots with minimal security. They worked quickly and efficiently. A grave that had been filled that very day was ideal. The earth still soft, easy to dig. They would excavate down to the head of the coffin, break through the lid, and extract the body using ropes or hooks. Then they would fill in the hole, replace the turf, and be gone before dawn, leaving little evidence of their work. The bodies would be delivered to surgeons who asked no questions, who paid in cash, who needed those cadavers desperately enough to ignore their provenance. A fresh body could fetch 8 to 10 pounds, a fortune for men who otherwise had few prospects. But sometimes the resurrection men needed to move their cargo through the streets. Sometimes they were interrupted in their work and had to flee. Sometimes they were simply abroad in the night, scouting graveyards, planning their next acquisition. And sometimes they encountered a watchman. What was an elderly man with a wooden staff to do against men hardened by their grim trade? Men who worked with corpses, who had long since lost any squeamishness about violence. The resurrection. Men travelled in groups, usually 3 or 4, and they were often armed with clubs or knives. A wise watchman, hearing suspicious sounds in a churchyard, would swing his rattle and keep his distance. But rattles could be ignored. Other watchmen might not come. And if the body snatchers decided that a witness needed to be silenced, there were watchmen who simply vanished, gone from their posts, their lanterns found abandoned, no trace of struggle. Perhaps they had fled their duty, or perhaps they had seen something they shouldn't have, encountered someone who couldn't afford to leave witnesses. Some watchmen came to arrangements with the resurrection men. A few coins to patrol elsewhere that evening. To hear nothing from that particular churchyard. To forget any shapes glimpsed moving in the darkness. It was pragmatic, really. Better to be paid for looking away than to be killed for looking too closely. The body snatchers were not the only threat. The footpads were perhaps more common and, in their way, more dangerous. Footpads were street robbers, muggers we would call them now, men and occasionally women, who lurked in alleyways and courts waiting for a mark. A drunk stumbling home from a tavern, a merchant who had stayed too late at his business. Anyone who moved through the dark streets with anything worth taking. They worked the same darkness as the watchmen. They knew the same streets, the same hiding places. And when they encountered a watchman, the calculation was simple. Could they take him? Was his lantern, his coat, his few possessions worth the risk? An elderly watchman alone on a dark street presented an easy target. The footpads would emerge from the shadows, clubs in hand, demanding his money, his lantern, sometimes his coat. Resistance was futile and dangerous. Most watchmen learned to carry a few pennies specifically for this purpose. Something to hand over, to satisfy the robbers, to send them on their way. But some footpads were not satisfied with pennies. Some were drunk or desperate or simply vicious. They would beat the watchman anyway, leaving him bleeding in the gutter, taking everything and leaving him to crawl to safety or die where he lay. The watchboxes themselves became targets. A footpad could wait until the watchman emerged for his rounds, then ransack the box, taking whatever meager possessions were stored there. Or they could trap the watchman inside, barricading the door, leaving him imprisoned in his own shelter while they conducted their business in the streets beyond. The watchman's vulnerability was profound. He was alone. He was usually old. He was poorly armed, and everyone knew it. The wooden staff was more symbol than weapon. Against a young man with a cudgel, against multiple attackers, it was nearly useless. Some watchmen tried to mitigate the danger. They would patrol in pairs where possible, though most parishes couldn't afford enough watchmen for this. They would avoid certain streets, certain courts known to be particularly dangerous. They would time their rounds to minimize exposure, moving quickly through bad areas, lingering in safer ones. But the duty required presence, required visibility. A watchman who hid in his box all night was failing his role. He had to be out in the streets, had to show himself, had to be that light in the darkness, even knowing what else the darkness contained. There were other predators too, the river pirates who would occasionally come ashore looking for opportunities. The gangs of children, feral, organized, dangerous despite their youth, who controlled certain territories and took offense at any adult presence. The mad or the drunk who might attack anyone for reasons known only to themselves. And then there were the fires. London burned constantly in this era. Timber buildings, open fires, candles, lamps. The opportunities for catastrophe were endless. A watchman who spotted smoke had to investigate, had to raise the alarm, often had to enter burning buildings to ensure everyone had escaped. Fire was perhaps the most democratic of dangers. It killed rich and poor alike. It could consume entire neighborhoods in hours. The Great Fire of 1666 remained in living memory, passed down through generations as a warning of what could happen when flame got loose in the city. The watchman's duty in case of fire was clear: cry the alarm, wake the neighborhood, direct people to safety, help organize the bucket brigades. But fire was terrifying, overwhelming, the heat, the smoke, the chaos. Many watchmen had seen colleagues die in fires, overcome by smoke or trapped by collapsing buildings. Every shift, every round through the dark streets carried the possibility of violence, of encountering something, someone who meant harm. The watchman could only walk his route, swing his lantern, call the hours, and hope that fortune would favor him one more night. Most nights, nothing happened. The predators were elsewhere. The streets remained quiet. The watchman would complete his shift, see the dawn arrive, and go home to sleep while the day watch took over. But some nights, a watchman would not return. His lantern would be found smashed in an alley, his staff broken, perhaps his body nearby, perhaps never found at all. And the parish would need to find a new watchman, a new old man willing to take the risk, to walk alone through the darkness with only a wooden stick and a failing candle between himself and everything that moved in the shadows. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was no watch at all. Complete darkness, complete lawlessness, every man for himself once the sun set. So they did it. These old men, these Charleys, they took their staffs and their lanterns and their rattles. and they walked into the night, alone, vulnerable, afraid, many of them, though they would never admit it, doing their duty, keeping the watch, calling the hours, hoping that tonight, at least, all would be well. By the 1820s, London had become ungovernable. The city had swollen beyond all recognition. Where once there had been perhaps 700,000 souls, now there were nearly 1.5 million. The old parishes, the ancient boundaries, the traditional systems of keeping order, all of these had been overwhelmed by the sheer mass of humanity that now crowded the streets. Crime was epidemic, not merely the petty thefts and occasional violence that had always plagued cities, but organized criminality on a scale never before seen. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. Pickpockets operated in coordinated teams. Burglaries were planned with military precision. And the old watchmen, those elderly Charleys with their rattles and their lanterns, were utterly inadequate to the challenge. Something had to change. Everyone knew it. The question was what and how and who would have the courage to overturn centuries of tradition. Enter Sir Robert Peel, Home Secretary, a man of vision, of determination, of ruthless efficiency. He had already reformed the criminal code, reducing the number of capital offences, bringing some measure of rationality to a system that had sentenced children to hang for stealing bread. Now he turned his attention to the problem of law enforcement itself. Peel understood something fundamental. The old system was not merely ineffective, it was philosophically wrong. The watchmen were reactive, passive. They waited for crimes to occur, then responded if they could. What London needed was something different, something proactive, a force that would prevent crime through presence, through visibility, through the certainty that lawbreakers would be caught and punished. He studied the systems of other cities. Paris had its gendarmerie. Other European capitals had professional police forces. But England had always resisted such arrangements. Professional police smacked of continental tyranny, of state oppression. The English prided themselves on their liberties, their freedom from government interference. Peel would have to be careful. He would have to create a force that was effective, but not threatening. Professional, but not militaristic. Powerful, but accountable. It would require delicate balance. In 1829, after years of political manoeuvring, after countless debates and compromises, the Metropolitan Police Act was passed. It was a revolution disguised as bureaucratic reform. The Act created a new force, the Metropolitan Police. To be stationed in London, initially covering an area extending 7 miles from Charing Cross, though not the City of London proper, which maintained its own ancient privileges and would eventually create its own separate force. This new police would be nothing like the old watch. These would be young men, fit men selected for their physical capability, their character, their intelligence. They would be trained, drilled, disciplined like soldiers, but taught to serve the public rather than dominate it. They would wear uniforms, not the red of the military, which would have been too provocative, but blue. A blue tailcoat, carefully tailored, a blue top hat, reinforced with leather to serve as protection in a fight. White trousers in summer, blue in winter. A leather stock around the neck, ostensibly for protection, but also ensuring an upright, professional bearing. The uniform was designed to be visible, recognizable from a distance. The new policeman would not hide in a watchbox. He would patrol constantly, walking a defined beat, moving through his territory in a precise pattern that ensured every street was visited multiple times each shift. Each man would carry a wooden truncheon, shorter than the watchman's staff, designed specifically for combat. He would carry a rattle, later a whistle, to summon assistance. He would carry a notebook to record incidents. And he would operate under strict regulations, a code of conduct that governed every aspect of his behavior on duty. The first recruits were selected in September of 1829. The requirements were specific: men between the ages of 20 and 35, at least 5 feet 7 inches tall, later raised to 5 feet 9, able to read and write, of good character with references. The pay was better than that of the old watchman, but not generous. A constable would earn 1 guinea per week, 21 shillings. From this, he had to purchase his own uniform, maintain it in good order, and support himself and any family. It was working-class pay, deliberately so. Peel wanted his police to come from the communities they served, to understand the people, to be of them rather than above them. They were trained at Scotland Yard, the headquarters Peel had established, drilled in their duties, taught the law, instructed in how to handle crowds, how to make arrests, how to testify in court. They learned to patrol at a steady pace of 2.5 miles per hour, a rate that allowed them to observe everything while covering their beat efficiently. The first patrols began on the 29th of September, 1829, a cool autumn evening. Nearly 1,000 men in blue tailcoats and top hats emerged onto the streets of London. The public reaction was mixed. Some welcomed them. Here, at last, was proper protection, professional law enforcement. The sight of a fit young man in uniform, walking with purpose, was reassuring in a way the old watchman had never been. Others were hostile. These new police were an affront to English liberty. They were government spies, continental tyranny imported to London. They were raw lobsters for their red uniform facings, or peelers, or bobbies, after Robert Peel himself, though these terms were not always used kindly. The new police faced violence. Citizens who resented their presence would attack them, would fight rather than submit to arrest. The early years saw numerous policemen injured, several killed. But they persisted. They maintained discipline. They did not retaliate with excessive force. They arrested those who broke the law, including those who assaulted them, and let the courts handle punishment. Gradually, grudgingly, the city adjusted. The new system began to work. Crime rates, particularly street crime, began to decline. The constant patrols meant thieves could not operate with impunity. The swift response to incidents, multiple constables converging when a rattle sounded, meant criminals could be caught rather than simply scared away. The professional approach to investigation meant more cases solved. The new police kept records, shared information, coordinated their efforts. They began to understand patterns of crime, to anticipate where and when offences were likely to occur. They were not perfect. There was corruption, as there always is. There was brutality, excessive force, abuses of power. But there were also mechanisms for accountability. Constables who broke the rules were dismissed. Officers who took bribes were prosecuted. The force policed itself with a rigor the old system had never possessed. The uniform became familiar. Children grew up seeing bobbies on every corner. The tall figure in the blue coat and top hat became a symbol of order, of civilization, of modernity. The Metropolitan Police represented everything the new Victorian age would come to value: discipline, efficiency, progress, rationality, the triumph of system over chaos, of order over disorder. They were the future made flesh, walking the streets of London in their precisely polished boots. And as they spread throughout the city, taking over parish after parish, establishing their beats and their procedures, they displaced something else, something older, something that could not compete with their youth, their vigor, their professional competence. The old Watchmen, the Charleys, the night watch. Their time was ending, and they knew it. The transition did not happen all at once. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 did not immediately abolish the old parish watch system. The new force took time to organize, to train, to deploy, and the jurisdictional boundaries were complex. The City of London maintained its own systems. Some parishes resisted change longer than others. But the direction was clear. The future belonged to the bobbies and the watchmen. The watchmen were simply waiting for the inevitable. Imagine you are a night watchman in 1830. You have walked these streets for 20 years, perhaps 30. You know every cobblestone, every doorway, every resident. This has been your life, your purpose, your identity. And now you watch as young men in blue coats patrol what used to be your territory. They walk past your watchbox, that wooden shelter where you've spent countless nights, and they do not acknowledge you. To them, you are already a ghost, a relic, something that will soon be gone. You still call the hours, though fewer people seem to care. The bobbies have whistles, loud and shrill, that serve the same purpose more efficiently. Your voice, that voice you've maintained for decades, seems suddenly quaint, unnecessary. You still carry your staff, but you've seen the truncheons the new police carry, purpose-built weapons designed for modern criminals. Your wooden stick seems laughable in comparison. You are old. You have always been old. That was part of the job, after all, a position for men past their prime. But now your age feels different, not venerable, not experienced, simply obsolete. The parish meetings discuss the transition. Dates are set. The old watch will be disbanded. The new police will assume full responsibility. It is all very administrative, very efficient, very modern. No one asks what will happen to you, because there is nowhere for you to go. This job, this poorly paid position that younger men mocked, has been your livelihood. You have no other skills, no other prospects. At 60, at 70, who will employ you? Some parishes offered small pensions, a few shillings a week, perhaps, enough to keep you from the poorhouse if you were very, very careful. If you had savings, if you had family who could help. Many watchmen had none of these things. The night of your final shift arrives. There is no ceremony, no recognition. You simply patrol your route one last time, call the hours one last time, and in the morning, you turn in your staff and your lantern, and you leave. The streets you've protected for decades will continue without you. The residents you've watched over, whose children you've seen grow, whose houses you've guarded, they will barely notice your absence. The bobbies will keep them safe now. Safer than you ever could, probably. You walk home in the dawn light, and you know that this is the end. Not just of your employment, of your purpose, of the thing that gave structure to your life. Some watchmen found other work, became crossing sweepers or porters, or took charity positions at workhouses. Anything to survive. Others could not adapt, could not find the energy at their age to begin again. They drifted into poverty, into the rookeries, those slums where the desperate gathered, into destitution. The workhouse was always there, of course, that last resort for those who had nothing. But the workhouse was a kind of death in itself, the complete surrender of independence, the admission that you had failed, that society owed you survival, but nothing more. Some chose different ends. The Thames was always there, dark and cold and final. How many former watchmen walked into its waters in those years? We will never know. The river kept such secrets. There were no newspapers' articles mourning the passing of the old watch. No public commemorations. The city was too busy celebrating its new police force, too excited about progress and modernization, to spare thought for what was being lost. But things were lost. Things beyond mere employment. The watchmen had been part of their communities in a way the new police could never be. They lived in the parishes they patrolled. They knew everyone, and everyone knew them. They were grandfathers, neighbours, familiar faces. Their presence was personal, intimate. The bobbies were professional. They were rotated between divisions. They might patrol a neighbourhood for a few years, then be transferred elsewhere. They kept emotional distance. It was part of their training, part of the modern approach to policing. Effective, certainly, but different. The old watchmen had been keepers of memory. They remembered when that house had been built, when that family had moved in. They knew the history of their streets in a way that could not be written down, only lived and remembered. When they died, and they died quickly, those first years after displacement, as elderly people often do when their routine is disrupted, they took those memories with them. The oral history of the parishes, the stories, the connections. There was a melancholy to those final years. Former watchmen would sometimes gather in the taverns they'd once passed on their rounds. They would drink cheap gin and reminisce about the old nights, the things they'd seen, the people they'd helped, the storms they'd weathered in their watchboxes. They would complain about the new police, of course. Too rigid, too young, too quick to arrest where a warning would have sufficed. They didn't understand the neighbourhoods the way a real watchman did. But beneath the complaints was grief. Pure, simple grief for a world that had moved on without them. Some died in poverty, buried in paupers' graves, unmarked, forgotten. Men who had spent decades keeping the city safe, ending their lives with nothing, no recognition, no gratitude, simply the final mercy of earth and silence. A few, very few, received small mentions in parish records. John Smith, age 72, former night watchman, deceased. No family, no effects. That was all. A life reduced to a single line in a ledger. The watchboxes themselves disappeared gradually. Some were removed immediately, cleared away to make room for the modern city. Others lingered for years, growing dilapidated, used as storage or shelter by vagrants, until finally they too were demolished. Children who had grown up hearing the watchman call the hours grew into adults who no longer remembered that sound. The past faded. The bobbies became the only police anyone had ever known. By 1835, the transformation was essentially complete. The old parish watch system was gone. The Metropolitan Police had established itself as permanent, professional, modern. And somewhere in the rookeries, in the workhouses, in the cheap lodging houses, the last of the old watchmen lived out their final days. Men who had once walked proudly through the night, lantern held high, calling the hours, keeping the watch. Now they were invisible, irrelevant, historical curiosities that the new age had no use for. They would sit by windows sometimes, these old men, and watch the bobbies patrol past, young and strong and efficient. And perhaps they felt pride that the city was safer now, that the profession, if you could call it that, had evolved into something better. Or perhaps they felt only loss, the deep, aching loss of men who had given their lives to a duty that no longer existed, who had sacrificed their youth, their health, their comfort to walk alone through dangerous darkness, and whose reward was to be cast aside when they could no longer serve. The night was different now, brighter, with the new gas lamps spreading throughout the city, safer, with the professional police on patrol, more orderly, more controlled, more modern. But something had been lost in that brightness, some quality of the old night, the human connection between watchman and community, the familiar voice calling the hours, the sense that the person protecting you was not a professional performing a duty, but a neighbour who knew your name. The Gothic darkness of old London was receding. The modern world was emerging, rational and illuminated and efficient. And in that transition, the night watchmen, those old men with their wooden staffs and their failing lanterns, simply faded away, ghosts disappearing at dawn, shadows dissolved by the coming light. They were not mourned. They were not remembered. They were simply gone. The city moved forward. Time moved forward. Progress moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to those it leaves behind. And the last watchman, whoever he was, wherever he died, took with him into darkness the final memory of what it had been like to stand alone in the absolute black of a London night, to call the hours into silence, to keep the watch when no one else would, to be the voice that said, "All is well, all is well, all is well," even when it wasn't, even when you were afraid, even when you knew that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, the world would have no more need of you. All is well. The last watch was ending, dawn was breaking, and the old night, the true night, was passing into history, forever. There is something that happens to the human mind when it lives in perpetual darkness. The night watchman existed in a world inverted from normal human experience. While others slept, he woke. While others woke, he slept, or tried to. His circadian rhythms, those ancient biological patterns that tie humanity to the sun, were disrupted, twisted, fundamentally altered. Sleep during the day is not the same as sleep at night. It is lighter, more fractured. The sounds of the daytime city intrude. Cartwheels on cobblestones, vendors crying their wares, children playing in the streets, church bells marking the hours. all of this prevents true, deep rest. So the watchman moved through his nights in a state of chronic exhaustion. Not the sharp tiredness that comes from missing one night's sleep, but the profound, bone-deep fatigue that accumulates over weeks, months, years of inadequate rest. This exhaustion colored everything, changed everything. The world at night is fundamentally different from the world by day, not merely darker, but other. Familiar streets become strange landscapes. Buildings loom differently. Shadows fall in patterns that confuse the eye. The mind, deprived of visual information, begins to fill in the gaps, to imagine, to create. A watchman walking his rounds in the deep hours would see things, movement in his peripheral vision that, when looked at directly, revealed itself to be nothing. A trick of the lantern light, a shift in the fog. But the movement had seemed so real, so purposeful. Sounds became unreliable. The acoustic properties of night are different from those of day. Sounds carry further in the cold air. They echo strangely off damp stones. A footstep 3 streets away might sound close. A voice nearby might seem distant. The watchman learned not to trust his ears entirely, learned that the night lied. Isolation does things to the human psyche. The watchman was alone for 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch. No conversation, no human warmth, only his own thoughts circling endlessly in the darkness. Some men talked to themselves, a murmured commentary on their rounds. Past the baker's now, all's quiet. On to the corner. Check the alley. Nothing there? Good, good. The sound of their own voice became company, a reassurance that they still existed. Others sang. Old songs, hymns, tavern ballads. Not loudly, that would disturb the sleeping citizens, but under their breath. The rhythm helped them walk, helped pass the time, helped keep the darkness at bay. The silence of the deep night is not peaceful. It is oppressive, heavy. It presses against the eardrums, creating a kind of pressure that makes one strain to hear something, anything, to break it. And in that silence, the mind begins to hear things that aren't there. A whisper that might be wind, a laugh that might be a cat. Footsteps following behind that. When you stop to listen, stop as well. The watchmen knew about these auditory hallucinations. They talked about them amongst themselves, in those brief encounters when one man's route crossed another's. Heard the follower last night, one might say, and the other would nod. Everyone heard the follower eventually. Those phantom footsteps that matched your pace. That stopped when you stopped. That resumed when you walked on. It wasn't real. They knew it wasn't real. But knowing didn't help. The footsteps still sounded, and you still fought the urge to run. The human mind is not designed for isolation and darkness. We are social creatures, diurnal animals who evolved to sleep when the sun sets. Forcing the mind to maintain alertness and function through the long, dark hours exacts a toll. Watchmen developed a particular quality of attention, a hypervigilance born of necessity and fear. Every sound had to be evaluated. Every shadow had to be examined. Every change in the environment had to be assessed for threat. This constant state of alertness is exhausting, more exhausting in some ways than physical labor. The mind never rests, never lowers its guard. Even in the watchbox, supposedly safe, supposedly resting, the mind remained alert, listening, watching. Over time, this hypervigilance became pathological. Former watchmen, retired from the job, would startle at sounds, would wake at night, unable to return to sleep, the old patterns too deeply ingrained. The night had changed them at a fundamental level. There were also moments of strange transcendence, times when the exhaustion and the darkness and the isolation combined to produce a state of consciousness unlike normal waking life. The watchman would feel himself dissolving into the night, becoming part of it, the boundary between self and environment growing thin. In these moments, the city would seem alive, not metaphorically, but actually alive, breathing, sleeping, dreaming. And the watchman was a cell in its body, a thought in its mind, moving through its streets like blood through veins. These experiences were rarely spoken of. They seemed too strange, too personal. But many watchmen had them, these moments when time stopped, when self stopped, when there was only the night and the walking and the eternal now. The stories the watchmen told each other were a kind of defense against the darkness, a way to structure the chaos, to make sense of what they experienced. Every watchman had ghost stories, specific corners where something had been seen, houses where strange lights appeared, alleys where the temperature dropped suddenly and for no reason. These stories were passed down from one watchman to another, becoming part of the oral tradition of the watch. Some stories were clearly inventions, exaggerations, the natural human tendency to make oneself the hero of a dramatic tale. But others had the ring of truth, the specific detail, the emotional honesty, the admission of fear. There was the hanged man of Cheapside. Multiple watchmen over multiple years reported seeing a figure hanging from a particular beam. But when they approached with their lanterns, there was nothing, only empty air. Yet they had seen it. The shape of a body, the slow rotation, the shadow on the wall. There was the child in white who appeared in the rookeries, a small figure in a pale gown, standing motionless in the darkness. Watchmen who tried to approach would find the figure always remained the same distance away. Following it led nowhere. Ignoring it meant its image would linger in the mind for days. There were the voices. Oh, the voices! Calling names, speaking sentences just below the threshold of intelligibility, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning, sometimes simply there, a murmur in the darkness that had no source. Were these ghosts, hallucinations, the products of exhausted minds operating in sensory deprivation? The watchmen themselves didn't know, couldn't know. They only knew what they experienced, and the experience was real, whatever its cause. The fear was real. The disruption of sleep afterward was real. The reluctance to patrol certain streets was real. Some watchmen carried charms, religious medals, horseshoes, herbs wrapped in cloth. Whatever their particular superstition suggested might offer protection. Against what, exactly? Against the night itself, perhaps. Against the things that moved in it. Against the slow erosion of sanity that came from living in darkness. The worst were the hours between 3 and 4 in the morning. The witching hour, some called it, though its effects extended well beyond a single hour. This was the nadir of the night, the point furthest from both dusk and dawn, the time when the body's defenses were lowest, when illness struck hardest, when death most often came to the dying. For the watchman, these hours were a trial. Exhaustion peaked. The cold was most penetrating. The darkness seemed most absolute. Every shadow harbored threat. Every sound suggested danger. The mind, desperate for stimulation, for anything to break the monotony, would create its own entertainment, and that entertainment was rarely pleasant. This was when the hallucinations were most vivid, when the distinction between real and imagined became most blurred, when a watchman might see his lantern light fall on a figure in the street, raise his rattle to call for help, and realize as he did so that there was nothing there, had never been anything there. The moment would pass, 4 o'clock would arrive, the world would not change. It was still dark, still cold, still dangerous, but something internal would shift. The worst had passed. Dawn was coming, even if it was still hours away. The psychological cost of the work was never acknowledged. There was no understanding in the early 19th century of what we now call trauma, or PTSD, or the effects of chronic stress. There was only the expectation that a man would do his duty. And so they did. These watchmen, these keepers of the night, they endured the isolation and the fear and the slow erosion of their mental health. They developed their coping mechanisms, the songs, the stories, the superstitions. They supported each other as best they could in their brief encounters, and they survived. Most of them, most nights. But the night left its mark in the lines of their faces, in the quality of their sleep, in the way they startled at sudden sounds, in the stories they told when drink loosened their tongues. They had lived in a world most people only glimpsed, had made their homes in the hours when humanity retreated, had stood guard at the boundary between civilization and chaos, between light and dark, between the waking world and whatever lay beyond it. It changed them. Fundamentally, permanently, they were men who had lived in the night, and the night, having claimed them, never entirely let them go. His name was Thomas Grimsby, and tonight was his last watch. 68 years old, night watchman for the parish of St. Giles for 32 years. Tomorrow, the new Metropolitan Police would assume full responsibility for these streets. Tomorrow, Thomas would no longer be needed. But tonight was still his. He emerged from his small room just as the sun was setting. September 1832. The air held that particular quality of early autumn, still warm, but with an edge that promised winter would come. He had known thousands of nights like this, but this one was different. His uniform, such as it was, hung loose on his frame. He had been a larger man once. The years had reduced him. His hands, wrapping around his wooden staff, were gnarled with arthritis. The fingers didn't bend as they once had. His lantern was old, the metal tarnished, the glass panels scratched and clouded, but the candle inside was new, and when he lit it, the flame burned steady and true. He made his way to his watchbox, the small wooden structure that had been his shelter for 3 decades. How many nights had he spent here? How many hours sitting on that narrow bench, listening to the rain drum on the roof, waiting for his next round? Inside, he had left a few possessions: a tin cup, a blanket, worn thin, a small flask that sometimes held tea, sometimes something stronger. He gathered these things. Tomorrow, someone would probably tear down this box, make room for the modern city. He wanted nothing left behind. The first round began at 9 o'clock. The streets were still busy, workers making their way home, taverns beginning to fill. the honest commerce of evening before the night's true character emerged. Thomas walked his route, the same route he had walked for 32 years, every corner, every alley, every court. His feet knew these stones better than they knew his own floor at home. Past 9 o'clock, and a fair, warm evening. His voice was not what it had been. Age had roughened it, weakened it, but it still carried. The old residents heard it and knew. This was Thomas, their Thomas, walking his last watch. A few came to their windows, a hand raised in acknowledgement, a face in the candlelight watching him pass. They knew. Word had spread through the parish. Tonight was the end of an era. 10 o'clock. The streets quieter now. The decent folk retreating indoors. The taverns loud with drink and song. Thomas passed them without stopping. He had learned long ago not to interfere with the taverns unless absolutely necessary. Men drinking wanted to be left to their drinking. Past 10 o'clock and all's well. Was it well? Was it ever well? These streets had seen so much misery, so much violence, so much quiet desperation. He had witnessed it all, had been powerless to stop most of it, had done what he could, which was never enough. 11 o'clock. A drunk stumbled from an alley, nearly collided with Thomas. Young man, barely 20. He looked at Thomas's lantern, his uniform, and laughed. Oi, Grandad, heard you old Charleys are being put out to pasture. About bloody time, innit? Make way for proper law. Thomas said nothing, stepped aside. Let the young man pass. What was there to say? The boy was right, in his way. The old system had failed. Something new was needed. But that didn't make the ending hurt less. Midnight. The bells of St. Giles tolled the hour, 12 sonorous tones that echoed through the narrow streets. Thomas stood in the shadow of the church and listened. How many times had he heard those bells? How many midnights had they marked? Past 12 o'clock and a cold, clear night. Not cold, really, but the formula required weather, and cool was close enough. The deep hours now, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, the streets nearly empty, the honest folk sleeping, the others, the thieves, the prostitutes, the desperate, conducting their business in the shadows. Thomas saw a figure in an alley, recognized the woman, Mary. She had worked these streets for 15 years, had aged terribly, as they all did. She looked at him, started to move on, then stopped. Is it true, Thomas? Tonight's your last? Aye. She was quiet a moment, then, you were always kind, never made it harder than it had to be. That meant something. She disappeared into the darkness before he could respond. 3 o'clock, the hardest hour. His legs ached, his back ached. The cold was settling into his bones, though the night wasn't truly cold at all. This was the cold he carried inside, the accumulated chill of 32 years of nights. Past 3 o'clock and all's well. But he stopped, stood in the center of the empty street, his lantern creating a small pool of light in the vast darkness. All's well. When had it ever been well? When had these streets been safe? These people protected? This city anything but a machine that ground the poor into dust? He had tried. God knew he had tried. But what was one old man with a wooden stick against the tide of poverty and desperation that defined these parishes? He thought of the men he had seen beaten, the women he had seen brutalized, the children he had found dead in doorways, frozen or starved or simply given up, all under his watch, all while he called out that everything was well. The tears surprised him. He hadn't cried in years, decades perhaps, but they came now, running down his weathered cheeks, for all the failures, for all the things he couldn't prevent, for all the people he couldn't save. For the sheer weight of 32 years of bearing witness to suffering. 4 o'clock. The hour passed, the worst of the night receding. Thomas wiped his face, collected himself. The duty wasn't finished yet. 5 o'clock. The first hints of dawn in the eastern sky. Not light, not yet, but a lessening of the absolute dark. A promise that the sun still existed, that it would return. Past 5 o'clock and a fair morning. He could see better now. The familiar buildings emerging from shadow. The street taking shape around him. The night releasing its grip. 6 o'clock. Day breaking. Workers beginning to emerge. The city stirring. The bakers already at their ovens. The market vendors preparing their stalls. The great engine of London starting another rotation. Thomas completed his final round, returned to his watchbox, extinguished his lantern. A young man was waiting there. Couldn't be more than 25. Tall, fit, wearing the new blue tailcoat of the Metropolitan police, the brass buttons gleaming even in the dim light. Thomas Grimsby? Aye. Constable William Hart. I'm to take over this beat starting tonight. They said that you could show me the route, if you're willing. Thomas looked at him. This boy who would replace him, who would patrol these streets with youth and strength and the backing of a professional force, who would do the job properly, the way it should have been done all along. The route is simple enough, Thomas said, but the streets take time to know. The people take time to know. He spent the next hour walking with the young constable, pointing out which houses held elderly residents who might need checking on, which alleys were most dangerous, which corners saw the most trouble. All the accumulated knowledge of 32 years condensed into an hour's conversation. The young man listened, took notes in a small book, asked intelligent questions. He seemed earnest, eager to do the job well. When they finished, he extended his hand. Thomas shook it. The grip was firm, strong. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best to serve the parish well. I know you will, lad. I know you will. Thomas walked home as the sun rose fully. The streets bright now, normal, the night completely gone. In his room, he placed his staff in the corner, his lantern on the shelf. He would have no use for them now. Perhaps he would sell them. Perhaps he would simply let them gather dust. He lay down on his bed, the sounds of the daytime city drifting through the window. He should sleep. He was exhausted. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at the ceiling and thought about all those nights, all those hours, all that darkness. It was over now. His watch had ended. Another man would walk those streets tonight, would call the hours, would keep the city safe. Thomas Grimsby was no longer needed, no longer useful, no longer anything but an old man with nowhere to go and nothing to do. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the familiar streets at midnight. heard his own voice calling the hours, felt the weight of the lantern in his hand. The night was gone, but it would never leave him. He had lived in it too long. It had marked him, claimed him. He was a night watchman, had been a night watchman, would always be a night watchman, whether he walked the streets or not. His last watch was over. But the watching never truly ended. And so, the old night watchman faded into history. Thomas Grimsby was one of thousands of men who gave their years, their health, their very lives to keeping the watch, who stood in the darkness while the city slept, who called the hours when no one else would. They were imperfect. The system was imperfect. But they did what they could, with what they had, in the world as it was. The new police were better, more efficient, more professional. The city was safer for their presence. This is undeniable. But something was lost too. Some quality of connection, some human element that could not be professionalized, could not be systematized, could not be modernized away. The watchmen knew their streets in a way the new police never would, knew the people, knew the rhythms of the night, were part of the community, not merely its protectors. When they disappeared, that knowledge disappeared with them, that intimacy, that deep, earned understanding of what the night was, what it contained, what it required of those who lived in it. We live now in a world of electric light, of professional police forces, of cities that never truly sleep. The absolute darkness that the watchman knew is gone, banished by technology and progress. But sometimes, on quiet nights, in the old parts of cities that remember, you might hear an echo, a voice calling the hours, faint, distant, as though drifting from another time entirely. Past 3 o'clock, and all's well. It is only the wind, of course, only the imagination, only the past refusing to stay buried. Or perhaps it is the ghosts of the old watchmen, still walking their routes, still keeping their vigil, still calling out to the sleeping city, still doing their duty, even in death. The watch never truly ends, not for those who have known it. They carry it always, in their bones, in their dreams, in the deepest part of night when the world is quiet and dark and still. The watchmen are gone, but the watching continues. Someone must always watch, always listen, always stand guard while others sleep. This is the way of things. From the first firekeeper who stayed awake to tend the flames while the tribe slept, to the modern security guard in his booth, the duty persists. Someone must watch the darkness. Someone must call out that all is well, even when it isn't, especially when it isn't. Rest now, dear listeners. Rest deeply. The watch is being kept. Someone stands guard while you sleep. Someone walks the night on your behalf. All is well. All is well. Let the rain fall. Let the bells chime. Let the darkness hold you gently. Your watch is over. You may sleep now. Sleep and dream of old London, where the watchmen still walk, lanterns glowing in the fog, voices calling the hours, forever and ever, into the endless night. All is well, all is well, all is well.